Hi, fourth graders, it's Mrs. Burke here with a video lesson for you. You've been doing a really great job with your decimals and understanding the value of the decimals, where to find them on number lines, how to represent decimals as fractions, and we're going to put all of that together today by adding fractions. And my last few lessons I've been doing with you, I've been doing a lot of work on a place value mat because it helps to keep our place values organized. Today's lesson of adding decimals also stresses a lot of focus on the place value. So a mat could be helpful. However, if you have access to a printer, a huge thing you can do to help yourself out would be just quickly Google large box grid template or printable, and print yourself out a grid paper that you can use inside the sheet protector. This is going to be my go-to manipulative or tool for adding and subtracting fractions. I've found that this grid paper is the best way when you're first starting to learn how to add and subtract these numbers. The grid is the best way to keep you organized, okay? So if you only have access to a mat, the mat will still be very helpful. I would not do these mentally. I know some of us are really great with mental math. This is different than adding whole numbers. So the mental math might have a couple of traps that you're not anticipating, which would lead to a wrong answer. So in the beginning, when we're just learning, I do suggest the use of the boxed grid paper that you can see up close. Okay. So on my grid paper, as always, I labeled my place values. I have my tens, my ones. When I have my decimal point, I always include that as a place value because it's super, super important. My tenths and my hundredths. And then I just made my columns down. So the key thing for adding and subtracting decimals is the decimal point. In whole numbers, an easy way to add numbers is to just line up our digits. So if I have 532 plus 221, both of those numbers are 3-digit numbers because they're all hundreds. However, when we move to decimal places, we can no longer line up our digits. Instead, we're going to line our numbers up by place values. And the easiest way to keep track of that is to keep track of where is my decimal point. So you're going to hear me reading these numbers out loud as I put them on my chart. You're going to hear me say decimal point. It's not how I read the number, but this is how I'm going to be organizing my number. So let me show you it in action. I would read this as 53 hundredths plus 89 hundredths. And lucky for me, these are both numbers in the hundredths place. So it's not too tough to add up yet. As I add this to my chart though, I'm no longer gonna say 53 hundredths plus 89 hundredths. I'm gonna focus a lot on this decimal point. So since I'm adding two numbers together, the very first thing I'm doing is placing my two decimal points. They always get priority. Those are the first things I put on my chart. Now I'm going back to the number. And even though this number is 53 hundredths, this is what I'm going to say. 0, decimal point, 5, 3. I'm going to come to my chart and I'm going to repeat that. 0 in the ones, decimal point, 5, 3. I repeated exactly what I saw. Here, this number 89 hundredths, what do I see? 0, decimal point, 89. 0, decimal point, 8, 9. And they're ready to be added. I'm going to put my plus sign because I know I'm adding. And I can see the top number says 53 hundredths and the bottom says 89 hundredths. I'm ready to line up. And I'm always going to start with my smallest place value, just like when you add whole numbers. 900ths plus 300ths, or 9 plus 3 is 12. So I put my ones down there, carry my 1 over. 8 plus 5, 13, plus 1 more, 14. Now, I'm not going to carry my 1 to my decimal place because that doesn't have any value. I have to carry it over to a place with value. So it's going to carry over to there or regroup. And then this is going to sound silly, but I always say decimal plus decimal equals decimal. All right. And then 0 plus 0 is 0, but I had this regrouped 1. So I have a 1 here. And my sum would be 1 and, remember we read that as and, 42 hundredths. All right. You're going to watch me do a couple of more. These first two are pretty straightforward. My next one, if I read it the proper way, it says 3 and 8/10 plus 4 and 4/10. So they're both numbers that go into my tenths place. So I first always place my 2 decimal points. And now I'm going to read what I see. 3 decimal point 8. 3 decimal point 8. Then I saw 4 decimal point 4. 4 decimal point 4. I'm going to double check 3 and 8/10, 3 and 8/10, 4 and 4/10, 4 and 4/10. Okay, so now let me add. 8 plus 4 is 12. Put down my 2. Carry my 1 over here to the ones place. Decimal plus decimal equals decimal. 4 plus 3 is 7, plus that 1 I regrouped would make it 8. So my sum is 8 and 2/10. 8 and 2/10. Okay, so now when does this get a little trickier? Right now. And maybe you can see why it's slightly trickier. Here I have 4 and 6/10 plus 1 and 37 hundredths. So why do you think this one might be a little bit trickier? It's because my first number is a number that ends in my tenths place, and my second number ends in my hundredths place. So I have to make sure I'm not going to line up my digits, but I'm going to pay attention to my place value. First thing that goes in my mat, I'm adding 2 numbers, so I'm putting 2 decimal points. Up next, what do I see? 4 decimal point 6. So 4 decimal point 6. My next number, 1 decimal point 3 7. 1 decimal point 3 7. So I have 4 and 6/10 plus 1 and 37 hundredths. But if you remember with comparing fractions last week, we always liked to either, even when they were as fractions, we always liked to make them both hundredths. If one of them was a tenth and one of them was a hundredth, we like to make them equivalent place values. So I can still do that when I'm adding. And this is, you don't have to do this when you add the 0 here, because remember, 0 has no value. However, if you get in the habit of this now, you will thank me later when it's time to subtract decimals, because that 0 will be more important than ever. So just for good practice and good habits, I always make sure all of my numbers go to the same place value. Okay? So now I'm ready to add. And remember, 4 and 60 hundredths is still equivalent to 4 and 6/10. I'm adding a place value that has no value to it. All right, so here I go. 0 plus 7, is 7. Sorry, got ahead of myself for a second. 6 plus 3 is 9. Decimal plus decimal is decimal. 4 plus 1 is 5. So my total equals 5.97. And this is kind of like adding money, dollars and cents. $5.97. All right, moving along. We have another one that might be a little tricky. Let's read it. 47 hundredths plus 5 tenths. Why is it tricky? Because my first number goes to the hundredths place, my second number only goes to the tenths place. But luckily, thanks to last week's lessons, I know how to make equivalent decimals. So my first thing, my 2 decimal points. Decimal point, decimal point. Next, 47 hundredths. What do I see? 0, decimal point, 4, 7, 0, decimal point, 4, 7. There's no room for mistakes when you do it like this. 0, decimal point, 5, 0, decimal point, 5. How can I make 5 tenths equivalent to hundredths? 50 hundredths. I'm adding no value to one more place value. I add them up. 7 plus 0 is 7. 4 plus 5 is 9. Decimal plus decimal is decimal. 0 plus 0 is 0. And I have 97 hundredths. Now this last one is the trickiest. Save the best for last. Okay. So this one's different for all sorts of reasons. Here, I'm working with 3 digits. Here, I'm working with 2 digits. In whole numbers, that number of digits is important. In decimals, it's just the place value that's important. So with this number, I'm working to my hundredths. With this one, I'm working to my tenths. This one has some value in my ones place, this one doesn't. So let's do the same strategies and see how we can get our answer. First thing I do, adding 2 numbers, I get 2 decimal points. Put those decimal points first, guys. Here I go. 71 hundredths, I see 0 decimal point 71. 0 decimal point 71. Then I see 1 decimal point 2. 1 decimal point 2. How can I make 1 and 2 tenths equivalent to hundredths? You'll thank me for this when you're subtracting. Add a 0. I never want to have them at different place values. Ready to add up? 1 plus 0 is 1. 7 plus 2 is 9. Decimal plus decimal is decimal. And 0 plus 1 is 1. So my final sum is 1 and 91 hundredths. So this is how you can easily and accurately, is more important, add your decimal points. Add your decimals. Please do yourself a favor and get yourself some grid paper and a sheet protector. This will be your savior. It will make your life so much easier while you're practicing with this. I do not suggest doing mental math, especially on the IXL. The way they make you enter the numbers, it kind of makes you shift your place values. It can get a little tricky. So I would just solve it on my mat and then enter it in your answer key, your answer space, okay? So good luck, take your time, pay attention to those decimal points and those place values. And I'll be back to see you on Thursday with another lesson focusing on word problems. Okay? Have a great day, Stewart School.